Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's live webcast. Third-party risk management program, performance improvement, and cost reduction. I'm going to turn things over right away to Dov Goldman, our director of the Hiperos Network. Dov, please take it away.
Thank you, Sharon. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's session. We have a very special guest today, Michael Carter from Grant Thornton. Mike has more than 20 years of experience across the consulting and banking industries and has served large global banking clients in both an advisory and an executive capacity. His experience includes assisting in business strategy, operating model design, and enterprise transformation. He's particularly recognized for his knowledge of indirect procurement and sourcing for the financial services industry and his knowledge of management control systems to monitor and mitigate risks. Mike has most recently worked as the procurement strategy executive for a global bank, leading efforts to evaluate procurement outsourcing, BPO, transform operational processes, and partner with regulatory agencies to bolster third-party management controls. And I'll add a personal note that I've been working quite a bit lately with Mike, and he's a true professional and a great guy to work with. Mike is going to introduce Grant Thornton, and then I'm going to say a few words about Hiperos before we continue with our topic today.
Thank you, Dov. I'll have a hard time living up to that introduction there, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak, and thank all of you for taking time out of your busy days to join us here. So real quickly, switch to the next slide, and we'll talk just a little bit about, excuse me, I'm having some difficulties here. There we go. Wanted to make sure I got a chance to introduce Grant Thornton as a firm to this audience. You may be familiar with us if you've done work outside the U.S. We have an expanding footprint, and we're actually the 5th largest professional tax advisory and audit firm in the world, about $5 billion in revenue, and somewhere in the neighborhood of about 42,000 to 45,000 employees across the world. The important thing I think to know there is just we are wherever you are, and we're able to do a large spectrum of risk and control related activities and are driving that brand into new areas every day. So let me hand over to Dov for just a second to talk about our partner, Hiperos.
Thank you. For those of you who are new to us, I'm just going to very quickly introduce Hiperos. We are a SaaS company. We're the market leader in third-party management. Our technology is used by some of the largest companies and brands in the world, as well as some industry consortiums, to help manage the complexities of doing business with tens or even hundreds of thousands of third parties. To define third party, a question we get asked frequently, this is everything from vendors, suppliers, contractors, and manufacturers on the cost side of the balance sheet to brokers, distributors, sales agents, and channel partners on the revenue side. So that's really all the third parties that make up your extended enterprise. Every third party has some risk associated with the relationship that you have with them. That risk can affect your organization from a perspective of regulatory adherence, whether revenue or reputation. One of the business processes that customers rely on us for is to help them assess these risks and to manage risk across their entire organization. So with that, Mike, why don't we jump in?
Sure thing. Thanks again. So we'll flip over here and get this slide content moving. Well, hang on one second. Live audience here, you never know what you're going to see. But I want to tee off the agenda first so we see what we're going to cover. You know, we talked about being able to address this in a general way to talk about third-party risk program performance improvement and the resulting cost reductions that associate with that. But I want to kind of take you through that story if we can. That's a lot of content to get through in an hour, but I'm going to hit these bullets really quickly just to kind of set the stage for the following conversation. So first off, we all are familiar with the rising cost of compliance. We'll talk a little bit about the improvement opportunities that face us as well as the challenges. I wanted to make sure this audience had a chance to you may have varying degrees of experience with the regulatory environment, but see some of the key regs and leave behind some materials that might give you a source for further research in the future. I think, and Grant Thornton thinks from a perspective of this is a holistic solution. You really want to approach your third-party risk management through a lens that looks at the full spectrum of your activities across that source-to-pay space, and we'll talk a little bit about that optimization. we want to share a third-party risk management framework that I think would be useful for you to leverage in the future, and talk really very specifically about some actions we've seen and that have had a success in helping build a sustainable program within your organization. And then we'll sort of turn to the industry and look at what the aggregated activities have done over this last several years to see this evolving practice maturity. Not only the individual companies are continuing to improve and move the dial, but those conversations they're having with the regulators are pushing the dial for all of us, and you'll see that maturity and the expectations that come with it move along. We'll give you some specific keys to success, and then we're going to actually go quite a bit deeper into some work that we've done to talk around process improvements and technology improvements. And I know that's a broad general topic for folks who may have systems in place or not have systems in place, but we'll be able to hit this at a level I think will be useful for most of you. And then lastly, we'll kind of talk about some of the direction I think the industry is heading in this managed service space, the difference between tactical and potentially comprehensive managed services in this third-party space. So let's get right to it. We'll talk a little bit about this rising cost of compliance. I don't think I'm surprising anyone with this story here. We've got the heightened regulatory expectations, the growth of new regulatory agencies, and the urgency to get in and prove their value is certainly raising the bar for all of us. I don't think our cyber audience out there, the cyber threat audience, is ever lacking for creativity in the ways, the complexity, and the volume of the threats that are expanding around us. As far as the sort of moving the dial on a continuous improvement perspective, I know a lot of firms have moved that dial significantly over the last several years, and that actually puts you at a disadvantage for being able to take that process capability 5% more when you're at the kind of at the top of the pyramid. Every incremental bit of change is that much harder to get. I know that in this space you guys have all probably struggled with data quality and data integrity. This is an area where you'll see large volumes of transactions, large volumes of suppliers, large volumes of questions and content. And whenever you have those components in your solution, you'll typically be concerned with that data quality and integrity, and that is something that drives up the cost when you're trying to solve for that. One thing that we are seeing as this programs have become more and more expansive and more entrenched and sometimes more and more proprietary, you will get to a place where you get this vendor participation fatigue. And so if any of you are in this space working with partnering with those vendors and figuring out how to get that due diligence information back, you'll see often fatigue from that vendor base, and we'll hopefully try to find ways to make that simpler going forward. One good thing for the folks attending this seminar today is that there's a competitive labor market for the folks that do what you do. Doing this well and doing this efficiently is a valuable commodity, and the labor market for the folks that can do this well has made that particular human resource cost drive north during the last several years. And of course, when we look at the pockets that we're pulling from, we've had this flat rate and interest rate environment that is not funding the coffers with tons of extra money for us to go out and build these risk programs. So all that together sort of puts us in a place where we've got heightened pressures, urgency, regulatory demands, less money to do it with, and a rising cost environment. So it takes us to a place, I'll jump quickly from that story to a story of where are we as an industry across the financial services space in dealing with this third-party risk management program concept. What we've done is some survey work, talking to folks out there, and what you may or may not expect to see is that really was kind of an 80-20 story here, that really across the spectrum of unstructured, where you really haven't understood what your program should or could do, and there's not very clear understanding of those different roles and responsibilities, rolling forward into emerging, which would be a place where maybe the roles are roughly understood, but there's not a lot of accountability baked into the system. on into an established program that may be clear and operational and functional but not optimized, down to world class, which we would say really has been fully optimized and is operating at the highest level. So across that spectrum, we are seeing around 80% of the respondents falling into that unstructured or emerging bucket. So it tells me there's still quite a bit of opportunity for improvement across the industry, and there's an opportunity to learn from some of the best practices that have been rolled out at the upper end of the spectrum. When we talk a little more specifically about some of the challenges that exist out there, I think what you'll see is on the left side of the page there, you talk about some of the inconsistent processes. And that's true company to company, but even within companies, business to business or business group to business group. And there's been a sort of a historical evolution of vendor management from a business silo perspective. And often what works well for one team might be completely different from what's working for another team. And so you've seen this growth of inconsistent processes, lack of standards, lack of a standard taxonomy or language about how the work's being done, and that has been a real challenge for driving a consistent program, because that's where obviously the regulators are wanting to see that. Down there, as we move counterclockwise on that circle, you'll see that increased regulatory demand and resource constraints that we just talked about on the previous slide. The nature of this work is often fairly manual and involves a lot of high touch of customized responses and data capture. And then couple that with the distributed nature of how your third parties support your organizations, often in a very fragmented way where one firm or one vendor may support multiple lines of business with unique contracts and often different services. So you get this very fragmented space where a decentralized audience of vendor managers are being asked to do something in a very standardized and structured way. And all that kind of leads us there to the top, where this gives us choppy reporting, sometimes limited visibility, and sometimes blind spots in our dashboard of risks across the space. All these things injuring our ability to really run an effective third-party program. And so, ideally, if we first step in this process is understanding these gaps and understanding these challenges that we're facing, and hopefully they're putting us in a better position to really solve for these three things you see on the right side, where we're fixing challenges with being able to really understand our inherent risks, understand the ability to monitor those activities and the remediation activities associated with them, and really hopefully closing some of these blind spots that if undetected are really serious weaknesses for our organization, things that the regulators really hone in on easily. They love seeing the disconnectedness or conflicts within a certain organization. They seize right on that. So that's a good segue for me to talk about some of those regulatory agencies. This may be super, familiar to many of you. Maybe the primary piece of your work is working from a regulatory compliance perspective with these partners, and talking with them, keeping them apprised of your efforts. But for those who don't have a good familiarity, you'll see the names on here have also not just the names of organizations, but some of the specific guidance and documentation that you can go out there and take a look at if you want to drill deeper here. I'll point specifically to the upper right-hand corner where you see that OCC 2013-29 guidance. I point to that. I know not all organizations are governed or regulated by the Office for the Comptroller of the Currency, but they have done a nice job of wrapping this whole package together and understanding it across the spectrum of plan, source, and manage. And across that spectrum, that continuum, it really lines up nicely with that source to pay, and then the operational BAU transactions that associate with the payments from that piece. You'll see a great understanding of what specifically that regulatory agency is looking for in your source, plan, source, and manage activities, and then supplementing that when you go deeper in spaces like info security or cybersecurity or some of the payment-related activities. You'll be able to see that through PCI and NIST and some of the other guidance that's out there. So I encourage you to, these are the sources of of requirements, and then as you see it kind of flow down, it is the source of your pain sometimes, as these enforcement actions, consent orders and other MRAs and supervisory findings flow down, typically in direct relationship to gaps and failures associated with with your performance against these standards. So if there are further questions, this will be content that's available at the end of the presentation, and easy to find on Google. And if you guys have any trouble finding this or have questions about it, both Dove and my contact information is at the back end. Happy to help point you to the right direction. So I'll jump from there, and we'll talk again. I touched on it earlier about the importance of a full cycle understanding of third-party risk management. It really comes into play across multiple dimensions from the very beginning to the very end. And so this is a sort of a simple wheel framework model that tries to describe this end-to-end coordination of what ideally is more of a closed-loop solution. You can control the vendors coming into your population through your strategic sourcing activities, that you're being planful and intentional and proactive as you define what your organization needs and which third parties you need to work with, and taking that through in a controlled way into your procurement operations, your contracting activities, and all the activities that really support that transition from I think I want to do business with you to, hey, we've got a well-structured contract and relationship and expectations that we can transact against. And some of the nature of the activities in that space lend themselves to the day-to-day BAU management of the relationship that kind of swings down as you look at that third circle at the bottom into the performance management space. And I tend to think of performance management and risk management all kind of in the same bundle. There's opportunities to segment that in your scorecarding and your attestation programs. But if you're effectively managing that third-party base, you really are looking at both performance and risk through this lens. And the relationship of those requirements, expectations, and actions to the contract SLAs and clauses and requirements should all be drawing directly from some of your earliest requirements when you've started this whole show back in the sourcing cycle. And then it is a cycle. I've mentioned cycle intentionally because you're going to take the output of that performance management activity and you're going to feed that back into the renewals and the continued improvement of your strategic sourcing or category management model. So I could spend a whole hour talking about this space, but I do just want to make the point that a well-controlled, well-managed end-to-end process has third-party risk management embedded and is a driver of the success of that TPRM program. So I mentioned earlier in the kind of kickoff as we talked about the agenda that we'd provide this framework, and this is Grant Thornton's third-party risk management framework. Just very simply at a high level, you can see those corporate objectives across the top, really the drivers of why you're working with your third parties. You may have desires to optimize your cost or to improve your client experience, or whatever those reasons are. You feel like it's important to partner with a third party. You've got risks that are opening up in that space, so you're exposing yourself to these key risk domains when you do outsource pieces of your work. And so some people just have a couple low-hanging fruit elements that they often point to. It may be business continuity or privacy or AML or info security risk. Those are the things that may jump to mind. But at Grant Thornton, we look across these 10 risk domains, everything from financial viability, contracting risk, strategic risk. I won't go through each of them here, but each of these risks have some unique characteristics, and you would want to look for specific diligence activities to get comfortable that the controls were done properly or put in place properly. Again, flowing down from the top to bottom in this framework, we have operating model components that are sort of pillars of a solid program. And you'll see governance, policies and standards, sound business processes, tools and technology to support those, not to drive those, and risk metrics and dashboards to make sure we've got good information and transparency of the process. And lastly, but certainly not least, is that risk culture, the overarching tone at the top, and the agreement and understanding of the value this work provides that hopefully is driving you to a sound program. And the bottom is really just all those activities above are occurring within this source-to-pay cycle that I mentioned earlier. So the planning activities, the diligence activities, your contract work, the actual monitoring and mitigation of the risks that are present, and then those things flow all the way through, even up to and including the termination process. And so everywhere along that life cycle, you're going to be wanting to have elements of your third-party management program touching them. I'll pause here a second, and we'll switch over to another slide. So let's say that you have put this as a priority on your corporate strategy roadmap, and you're thinking, what do I need to do to move in this direction? I see that I've got regulatory demands. I understand some of these cost constraints. I'm working to optimize my source-to-pay program, but I really want to focus on moving the dial and maybe leveraging this framework to build out some improvements in my third-party risk management program. I think as you'd probably hear a lot of consultancies say, really start by understanding where you are today, kind of that as-is assessment of your work. And so to feed that, I know this is not a comprehensive story, but we tried to offer 8 or 10 ideas of places to look, and I'll just rattle off a couple of them here. But you see that cyclical, again, the concept of all this stuff feeds one another. From planning through diligence, contracts, all the way up into termination, you're going to see governance activities happening around there of review, oversight, documentation, reporting. That model is something that you can use as a kind of a sanity check or a guiding principle as you think about the operations inside your company. But really, I think a couple key things to jump out is, it's important that you understand the risk and you've had a chance to segment or stratify your third-party base. And so understanding and honestly assessing how effectively you are doing that today. Is that a cumbersome, manual, difficult to repeat process that leaves you with unclear results? Or are you doing that in a way that's repeatable, reproducible, efficient, and yields a consistent output? I think when you think about certainly the financial services industry, you often get pulled into a risk management conversation, leads you to a first line of defense, second line of defense, third line of defense model. And the testing and monitoring is something that gets overlooked quite a bit. And you'll have opportunities to really tune up your program by optimizing that mix of first line monitoring activities and second line QA or testing activities. And just that piece of work can often yield significant savings from a efficiency of resources perspective. I won't go through each one of these little points here, but I would definitely say as you look at your program, and you're introspective and you're honest about what you're doing there, really figuring out a couple of these weak spots like spend across geographies, multiple countries where processes or data may be inconsistent, figuring out a way to deal with a third-party umbrella that may or may not be completely comprised of what we typically would call vendors. From a policy perspective, this is a place to look at your policies and ask, when I look at third parties, have I clearly defined what a vendor is versus somebody who might be incidental spend or something that falls into a non-vendor bucket like exchanges or joint ventures or affiliate relationships. Really understanding those and putting policies in place that empower you to drive out processes and activities to support those. So again, I probably spent more time on those 10 than I need, but I really do think if you're interested in going down this path, we really need to understand where you are to be able to prioritize the work that's ahead of you. Here, if you'll let me click on this next thing. Sorry. Better at third-party management than I am at slide running, so thanks for your patience. I talked earlier about the evolution of this program, and many of you who might have been in this marketplace or this space for years and years have seen it grow and progress with various regulatory guidance being offered throughout time and different agencies popping up at different points in time. But all that activity has forced the industry to kind of move along, and that bar has steadily risen. Those kind of early expectations, I can remember when maybe a regulator may just come in and ask you, can you produce a list of who your vendors are? And even that might have been challenging with the data and the attention that had been given to the solution years and years ago. But it certainly has elevated beyond that. And what we're seeing is not just an expectation of do you know who you're doing business with, but can you point to the association with the upstream strategic planning activities that drove you to do business with those folks? So really that linkage of, hey, I see you know who you're doing business with. Do you know why you're doing that, and can you point to the documented reasons? And can you go downstream with that and prove to me that you've got good contractual coverage in those spaces? Those might have been good assumptions back in years ago, but you may now have regulators asking you, okay, show me the actual contracts and where you're storing these for each of your key relationships, or each of your relationships that rise above a certain risk tolerance. And I can tell you, most of the companies that we go and talk to have significant gaps in that area, with contracts possibly being on papers, slid under desk blotters, or sitting in desk drawers. I know none of you guys have that experience, but some of the banks out there are faced with that today. So as that bar continues to rise, the expectations of the industry is we will continually improve. We will implement enhanced due diligence capabilities. We will be specific to risk domains, and we will capture evidence and documentation that's easily, readily available. And it's going to build us, hopefully, a transparent, efficient, and sustainable model. So again, we talked earlier about what we're seeing from a survey perspective. We only see about 20% of the population really sitting in this kind of model I've described. The rest of the folks are either very new into defining a program or have not really gotten the traction that they need in that space to date. So when we think about committing to this path and looking at setting the bar to achieve a better third-party risk management program, we wanted to call out a couple of keys to success. And some of this stuff may seem pretty self-evident, it may be obvious, but paying it the proper attention and making sure that it's dialed into your transition or to your transformational program, and that you've got very intentional actions to drive these things. They don't often happen by accident. So going through these, and I'll just touch on them quickly and not drill into every little piece, but we talked about risk culture earlier, and that strong tone at the top is an important component to really driving success. The executives that lead your businesses need to know why you're doing this. They need to be bought into the story, and they need to drive those actions and accountability through their businesses to make that third-party risk program successful. If the value story is not there, or if the value story is not sold well, you'll end up seeing people going through kind of a check-the-box exercise, and you won't be actually achieving the cultural change and the reduction in operational risk that you're probably wanting to see. I've got this next bar tagged, tone in the middle, kind of a simple step down, but I don't want to overlook the fact that so much of the work in most of our organizations is actually executed at this sort of the top of the middle tier of your management folks, where those folks that are carrying all the weight, that are doing this work, they need to really understand how to prioritize and attack the work to drive out the actions that you want. So you may set that tone at the top, but you're going to need to cultivate those relationships and really plug those key leaders and executors into your project governance. And so if you can be intentional about putting your project plan together, setting your tone at the top, and then finding those key instruments of success and the people who really move the dial inside your company, to spend some special care and feeding with those guys, so that you know that he or she will be a true advocate for your process and not somebody who's going through the motions. I'll touch just briefly on these other couple, but having the right strategy, routines, governance wrapped around this program to help make it sustainable and to keep it from falling apart shortly after launch. Similarly, from a sustainability perspective, you'll want to really give some thought to your training program. I know a lot of system implementers may say, yeah, at the very end of the project, we'll slap in some reports and we'll define a training program. And I think you really want to pull that forward, and you want to make sure that not just the content is appropriate for the actions you're trying to drive, but that you're getting good sign-off and governance around the development and approval of all that training, and that you've got a model that captures the right people with the right message and is repeatable and ideally baked into some sort of recurring program. It's not to disparage any of the other risk domains, but often you'll see mandatory training that's being rolled out for everything from info security to privacy to ethics, but you may not see mandatory third-party training that's rolled out across a broad piece of the organization, and I think that's a miss in most cases. It's an important part to the sustainability and to the driving that risk culture. I won't drill deep on the next two, but having solid reporting, making sure that you don't treat reporting as an afterthought, and that access to information is both consistent and available and accurate, is going to help put the information in the fingertips of what is typically a fairly distributed audience of relationship managers. And all that we've just discussed, all the way from the tone at the top, the people, access to information, it helps feed this network of support, figuring out sort of who your formal and informal network of folks are, extending out even into your key vendors. That network of support and really being intentional about building and caring, feeding for that network is all pieces that drive to a successful program. Let me flip over here. I think we're doing okay on time. I think try to drive through here these last pieces. Process-related improvement. So I'll just step back for a second and say, often a program has been implemented in the past, either with or without tool support. There's been enough regulatory pressure that regardless of the size of your organization, there's probably been some even just lip service paid to the third-party program. And so what we're seeing now, at least Grant Thornton is seeing, and I'm seeing personally, are companies reaching out saying, hey, we tried to do something and we rolled something out. We may have purchased a tool, or we may have done a pretty comprehensive transformational project, but we're looking at this now and we're not seeing that it meets our needs perfectly today. And they'll have us come in and take a look and see if there's opportunities for process improvement, and I'll talk about tech in just a second as well. But these are a few bullets I just wanted to call out as some of the typical things that we're seeing and some opportunities to tune this up. Now, I want to be completely open here about this. For folks who have a fairly mature program, you may see some of these gaps, but for others, you may not have the maturity in your process yet to even evidence some of these gaps. So it is a challenge, and I thought I would start kind of at a higher end, more mature program that would have some components we could talk about possible gaps and areas to improve. So one thing is, for those that are kind of onboarding the majority or even all of your vendors through some sort of material assessment, like, should these people be in my program? Are these third parties people that should fit in my program? There's opportunities there to tune that process up or to close doors and to hopefully reduce the complexity there. What we've seen is some people kind of went very academically with this, and they may have put a ton of questions together, or they may have a very complex tiered program, or they may have so many stakeholders in the process that and various processes that it's either difficult to ensure that you've got the right third parties in your program, or it may be easy for you to miss opportunities to pull somebody in, or for you to have the wrong people in your program at times, and that's sometimes can be just as painful. The other thing that we find is because you've got this kind of, if you do have an effective front door and you're grabbing and evaluating people and companies as they come into your process, you may find other stakeholders in the organization want to leverage that. Hey, I'd love to know more about XYZ every time you onboard a vendor. And sometimes that information kind of drifts outside the boundaries of really what you need to be effective at either sourcing, transacting, or managing with, activity with that vendor. So really be intentional and lean that process as much as you can, so you don't find yourself, kind of doing the bidding of other groups gathering information for you. Another place that we've seen pain, especially for folks who've deployed systems, is that you may get ready to perform an attestation or an annual recertification or launch a wave of diligence activities across a certain spectrum of your third-party base, moderate risk or high risk, however you'd like to slice your world up. You often will end up pushing that out irrespective of other change that's in flight in your organization. And so you'll see these collisions. Oh my gosh, I can't believe we did our ethics, privacy, and info security training on the same day that we launched, due diligence surveys for 3,000 of our highest risk vendors. So number one is just an awareness of change and avoiding collisions in your organization. But number two is we've been able to help folks design and define incremental strategies that will level load that work and not dump a ton of diligence activities on a small population all at one time. So being able to tune that up is something I think is important. There's an area, and I could talk a long time. I know Dove likes to talk about this topic here around the low-risk population. So, while we're busy guarding the front door of the highest risk vendors, there's often this low-risk exposure that we might see for people that we think, well, gosh, that's a nominal risk. There's really no exposure with this vendor base. There should be some sort of a program in place to address that, and to really look at it through a different lens that a new threat vector is out there that cybersecurity criminals and others are sometimes looking at that low-risk vendor as an easy door to get through and use either social engineering or some sort of stair-stepping model to get to the good stuff, in a different, more high-risk place. So I just would encourage you to not ignore that low-risk population and to think about some level of program that would address that space as well. Last one I'll mention on here is just the idea of vendor governance. Some places we see this lumped in together in just one large operational risk bucket, and the escalation of those things that fall outside of your tolerances as risk becomes, moves outside of your appetite and activities need to be escalated for approvals. We found a best practice really to have dedicated third-party oriented committees and routines and governance structure so that it's not just one bullet on an agenda of a larger story. You get the opportunity to really understand and apply the right attention to that content. So there are a few others on here, but in the interest of time, I'll flip over from the process-related improvements to the natural extension of the technical-related improvements. And again, I'm making a leap here that you've used some tools to support a process that's been put in place. We still continue to find a lot of folks that are using combinations of Excel spreadsheets and SharePoint to run these fairly complex solutions. But for those who have moved into applications that are a little more advanced, or certainly very mature and advanced, like our partners here at Hiperos, we still see some opportunities to improve the technology and the way those technology solutions were deployed. So we typically kind of go through this I won't call them three phases, but three cycles of looking at the technology after we've figured out what we think is really the challenge. And we'll typically look to stabilize any sort of urgent technical challenges. These may be, failure to have proper change management and, the asynchronous nature of the testing and development and production environments can cause challenges. We can see places where just maybe there hasn't been the proper care and feeding or resources to really put a program on a stable, steady state. And those are the first places we go in and try to help. After that, and we kind of know we've got steady state, we're looking at where things have are really still broken but not gone completely off the rails. And the things we see there typically is data normalization, some tactical cleanup, localization of fields, making sure that information is sound at its core and you're not getting bad reporting. kind of that garbage in, garbage out, but sometimes it doesn't look like garbage when you've got fields that make sense from one questionnaire to another questionnaire to another questionnaire. But when you look at the themes and the reporting, you really want to see consistency across those. So often some work to do that cleanup on making sure your data import processes, your data management processes, and your, as you change through the evolution of your program, you're not leaving kind of ghosts and remnants and things out there that can muck up your final reports. Another area that we've seen is, I'll call it, well, I don't have really a name for it other than some folks don't feel like their program is mature enough to leverage the automation that's available. And so we've seen folks go in and turn off automated features or the triggers that would naturally link activities together. There's not a level of trust in the organization to do that, and they'll say, well, we can't turn this on automatically because we've got to go back in and check something that came in because we keep getting garbage from the first line on this. And one thing that we would continue to encourage is to put that accountability where it belongs and to automate the pieces of the processes that should be automated. So leveraging those automated program triggers and kicking off activities when they should happen naturally and managing by exception rather than having to do sort of babysitting and hand-holding and using your centralized resources to kind of oversee, revalidate, and quality inspect everything that comes in the door before you allow the next layer to kick off manually. And for those who have questions about that, I'm happy to follow up with you. But if you don't have a system in place that has those capabilities, you probably don't know what I'm talking about. But if you've been there and you've turned some of these things off because you're worried about letting it move too quickly, we think there are some approaches that will let you take advantage of that. Another bucket of activity in this testing, in this remediation space is the, I'll just call it sort of data aggregation, some of the scripting and the roll-up activities where you take multiple questionnaires with scores that can be weighted. Often folks have gotten careless with the way those weights are managed or the way that those final reports are, the output is digested. And so there's some work that we've been able to help folks with kind of cleaning up those aggregations and score roll-ups with some work that might be considered too advanced for the third-party management team, but we've been able to do that pretty successfully, both in format and style, from a kind of a style sheet perspective, or from algorithms and content and math to sort of make sure that you're getting the right output to drive the right risk decisions with your tiering and with your diligence. And lastly, I'll just mention that there are some places where everything may be working fine, but there's an opportunity to optimize. And often what you'll see here is in, I talked earlier about the timing associated with deployment of waves of diligence, often referred to as periodicity. So if you have a technical constraint on your ability to manage when certain waves of diligence activities are released or when certain questionnaires move out to your internal audience or your external vendors, we've been able to work with our partners at Hiperos and help technically solve that problem to give you more flexibility and level load that activity across your internal external partner base. And then there's two last bullets there under enhanced. I think there's always a desire to have better, more efficient, more accessible, more accurate reporting, and we've done some work in that space. And then lastly, something that gets overlooked sometimes is just the training on that reporting. So you may have a perfect tool that's in place, but your distributed audience still likes to pick up the phone and ask you for information, or they stumble through a tool without being able to find what they need. So sometimes the solution is not a technical one, but rather training on the technology. So I covered a lot of bases there, and hopefully through that discussion of process and technology, it can give you some insights into maybe a place that you need to raise your hand and ask for help, or you've got the capabilities and the resources internally to focus on some of these topics. So I'll sort of shift here. I know as I talked through the agenda, the last thing I had out there that I was going to tee up is something that we're seeing as a trend in the industry over the last couple years, and something I think will continue to accelerate, and it is this concept of managed services. And I won't go deep on the slide here that I've got describing the roles that you would typically see in a third-party management program. But if we just cover this from sort of left to right, you've got your process owners, you've got your risk owners, the people that actually run the business, and they're looking to this director of this program to guide and drive the mitigation of this operational risk. So to be effective, most companies have sort of a functional leadership team or functional lead who's working for this director, and they are driving out two main buckets of activity, either vendor management liaisons, so helping to communicate and guide and steer and respond to information flow with their distributed vendor managers, engagement managers, contract managers, however they're termed, and they're looking at their management of their internal processes and the governance and the routines to keep the program afloat. So that functional ownership is typically staffed fairly well, and we got smart people. You guys are possibly filling some of these roles, and it's a place where you often can afford to dedicate a resource to those functions. As we move into some of the areas that are a little bit more shaded, you'll see areas where you'll see partial FTEs being staffed often. So in a system administration role where potentially one person may have multiple applications in their portfolio, and they're charged with managing users, managing change, managing upgrades, managing any of the things about that system that might be taken for granted by the functional user base, that system administration role, and the associated data management and reporting management that goes along with that. You may see one person in a part-time role covering this for a very large organization. And so it is when you see these partial roles that it's likely an opportunity to leverage some managed services. I also mentioned just briefly across the bottom there where you see the vendor managers and risk assessors, and I'll talk a bit tactically in a second about where folks have been able to leverage distributed or outsourced organizations to manage some of that assessment work. And we can touch on that in just a second. So what we've seen, though, is this model where the client or the bank or the financial services institution that's represented by sort of owning the third-party risk management program will still obviously retain ownership of some of the key processes. They're going to own the risk. They're going to own the setting of standards, the tolerances, the approvals, the sign-offs, the methodologies for scoring. All that stuff is owned, but tactically, as we looked at on the previous slide, companies are reaching out and filling those individual roles, or in this case, what I've tried to describe is that there are kind of horizontal slices across the programs. So while they may own the process and they may own the sign-off on the final approvals of something, the distribution and the chasing of diligence questionnaires may be outsourced to a third party. And this third party could be responsible for reaching out to your vendor base, understanding the key risks that the product or service presents, just presenting the appropriate diligence questionnaires, seeing that they're completely and accurately completed, potentially validating that the content is right, correct, and the supporting documentation is there, and then bringing that back to the client bank or the FI to say, hey, we've talked to so-and-so, we've got the right risk domains understood, we've collected this information and validated it, and we have comfort from an attestation perspective that it's well supported. Now it's in your shop to understand and accept that risk or approve this work. And so that's kind of where we get to, is slice by slice, companies are going in and looking at those opportunities to leverage outsourced providers, and where they see partial resources, they're having opportunities to move pieces over offshore. The one last sort of topic I'll mention here is, in a very large organization, you'll see these sorts of activities probably, choosing to make efficiency calls by taking a piece, maybe even tactically solving with the support of some third parties. What you will see in some of the smaller organizations, and I'm talking here about maybe financial services institutions under $25 billion in assets, all the way down into the community bank scale, where you may see full program outsourcing. And that's where I think the longer-term future direction is going to be, where service providers are stood up and made available to handle turnkey the programs, and just have key select people inside those smaller institutions who are positioned to own and accept the risk and be sort of the I won't say the brains, but the brains and the controls behind a fully operational program that focuses in on the highest tier risk vendors for info security, business continuity, privacy, some of those key risk vendors. So I've kind of spent a lot of time there, but I do think it's an area that the market is heading, and it may be something your company thinks is worth investing in. As we're getting really close to the end, hopefully I'm doing okay on time. You guys can keep me honest here, but I just wanted to touch base on, some of you on the phone may say, gosh, this is interesting. I just don't know really where to start. I know Mike's given me a couple of ideas about some stuff to look at in my internal organization. But one thing I want to do is kind of tee up where people are asking us to help. So there's a kind of a brief health check where we can come in and do a quick review of your organization, your process, your people, and give you some feedback on where we think some opportunities for successful transition may be. We've also been asked to come in and just advise on programs strategy. Where do you think we should go? What do you think we should do? And we can take our experiences with other potentially peer-sized institutions that match up with your expectations, your regulator demands, and give you some advice on where the design of the program should go, what kind of model development or risk assessment activities are appropriate, and advise on modifications possibly to reporting and analytics. And then lastly, there's a bucket there that's really, I'll call it more soft science activity, but where we've been able to come in and help folks with communication strategies, training strategies, awareness campaigns. Sometimes they feel like they've got the right capabilities, they just don't have the right awareness or buy-in, and we've been able to help folks with that. So I'll just leave that thought with you as folks are thinking about how to engage as you're wanting to move the dial for your particular program. And then you may be sitting in a space where you don't really have a program in place, and you may want to talk strategy, but you want to think about who could I partner with and where could I find some support to help drive this. I may not have the resources in-house to really move the dial. And so I'll just start briefly, and then I'll hand off to Dove. But I wanted to say that the expertise and the subject matter expertise of that partner is going to be key for you. So the speed at which they can slam in a certain tool is not going to be your primary driver. You're looking for folks who've got experience in this domain, who've worked with those regulators that will be governing you, and that folks who ideally maybe even have a supplier experience across that multiple industries that feed your third-party base. So that I'll pause there and hand over to Dove to talk about some of the other characteristics they see in a successful partner as you're trying to change your program. So Dove?
Thank you, Mike. So actually, I'd like to address something that will simplify some of this for our audience. There's so much complexity here in this topic, and we could be talking, I'm sure, for hours about it. Kind of a rule of thumb, when should you consider some kind of a more advanced solution than Excel spreadsheets for managing your third parties? And I think there's a good rule of thumb here in that when you have more than 100 third parties, you are beyond the capacity of a spreadsheet, because, well, a spreadsheet is really only something that one person can look at a time. This is very much a collaborative sport, as Mike, as you've said. There's a lot of people involved in, a lot of stakeholders. So when you pass the capacity of a spreadsheet, really one person, one FTE working on a spreadsheet can manage about 100 vendors in our experience. That's when you have to consider some kind of a more advanced solution, something like a third-party management platform like our Hiperos third-party management tool. That will provide you with an efficient, cost-effective way to assess a large third-party population using centralized data and automated data-driven workflows. That's really all I'd like to say at this point. I think we need to allow some of our guests to ask questions. So Sharon, can we open up the lines so that they can throw their inquiries at us?
Absolutely. So we do have a number of questions that have come in. So our first one How do you get your lines of business engaged in the third-party risk management process?
Well, I talked a little bit earlier about that sort of senior level engagement, that tone at the top, and what I've seen be successful is taking that message out to those key business leaders. So let's say you've got 4 or 5 business lines, maybe a retail bank, a credit card solution, a mortgage bank, a commercial lending. You're going to have representatives at the top of each of those house stacks to really understand and champion your program. So it is putting some skin in the game with those guys. It is understanding that they own the risk and putting the responsibility for complete process adherence metrics, if you will, or complete execution of your program to sit at their feet. And then from an execution monitoring perspective, it's kind of a fame or shame model, I like to call it, where you've got them stacked up against their peers, where you can see like percentage of completion or some effectiveness metrics that have been put in place on a dashboard, and there's typically some natural competition between those senior leaders that if they can be called into a routine governance activity around third party, and one of the activities on the agenda is to review program compliance across their various spaces. It's nothing like having one executive look over at the other guy and talk, give him a hard time because he's at 12% and this other guy's at 88%. And so that fame and shame model of engaging with those senior leaders and making sure that the program success metrics are visible and accountable at that level is often what I've seen make it successful.
Great, thank you. We just had this question in. How can an effective third-party risk management program benefit strategic sourcing?
Third party, let's see. I think at the end of the day, it is a cycle. It's a cyclical nature of this program, and so if you've got a strong program of management, you're going to help feed requirements into a strategic sourcing activity. They're going to know what's important to be successful in the business because that cycle of management activity is going to be weeding out bad players and encouraging and rewarding good players. And it should make this selection process more discreet and intentional, and it should give you good data to feed your future sourcing activities. So there's probably a lot of places that I could go with that, but I'll just try to be brief and say, just as third party is supported by a strong end-to-end source-to-pay program, the sourcing process is similarly benefiting from the rigor and the discipline of an effective risk management program.
Mike, this is Dov speaking. Can I throw one more kind of a nuts and bolts point on top of what you said?
Sure.
Which is that when you implement a program like this, you're creating a golden record. You're creating a database that may not exist in many companies. And so you are providing them with data that they don't have today about their vendor relationships. And so they may be able to more strategically source because they have access to information about who they've already sourced from, who they're doing business with, and how those vendors are performing.
Gotcha.
Great. All right, so we have another question. Effective third-party risk management clearly depends greatly on vendor participation, vendor compliance, if you will. How are vendors reacting to the growing volume of requests for due diligence and audits, and are there ways to ease the burden on them, and should we be concerned about this?
Let me let Dov take this because I think there's some opportunities around standardization and cooperation that might be right in his wheelhouse.
Yes, thank you, Mike. So actually, I've been seeing a shift that some of our banking customers have been making me aware of. They've been saying that up until relatively recently, they felt like they could pretty much demand anything from a vendor in terms of due diligence documentation or compliance with an audit request. And they're now saying that balance of power is shifting, and the vendors are starting to push back. Because the volume of these requests is so large, and it's only going to grow as the regulatory issues even regulatory issues that are there today but are not really being addressed. As these start to be addressed by banks and other organizations, the volume that vendors are going to see is growing, and they know it. Everybody knows it. And so, as you said, I think that the part of the solution here is on standardization, making it possible for vendors to take a very basic vehicle for due diligence, a questionnaire, have standardized questionnaires, standardized within an industry or across industries. Let a vendor answer once and share that across many customer requests. Well, that's a way to greatly enhance the efficiency of the process. And I'm spending a lot of time talking to senior executives at some of the bigger vendors, and they're saying very clearly that programs that create this standardization, they really help because they can greatly reduce their response times. Customer wants something, they'll get it a lot faster if they're willing to accept a standard response. So everybody benefits on both sides.
Great. So we have time for one more question. What are your recommendations for managing fourth parties?
Okay, I'll take that. It's interesting. Fourth parties or subcontractors are touched on in some of the regulatory guidance and some of the documentation that's out there, but they're rarely very prescriptively addressed. And so it leaves open the interpretation for what we should be doing in that space. And I think you have to treat each subset of subcontractors differently according to the risk that they present. So I typically recommend that we look at that through a category-driven lens. So you might treat subcontractors in your facility management space differently than you would treat subcontractors in your application development space. And so understanding what those key risks are and then ensuring that your contracted party does two things. One, that they're adhering to any limitations or restrictions or requirements on approval for leveraging fourth parties. So if you've done your contracting work properly, you have a control that will allow you to limit or control the amount and volume and type of work that's being handed off to subordinate fourth parties and further subcontractors. But if you don't even have that control and you know that you're being exposed to that fourth party risk, you should demand sort of an equivalent third party risk management model from your vendor. And so often it's times where you don't have to go physically test or validate at the fourth party, but that you can gain comfort and confidence in the actions of your vendor, of your third party, to prove to you that they're effectively managing their vendors. This comes into play a lot with either background checks or some of the testing and training that is required for certain activities. Rather than having to go out to the extended fourth party, you can review logs and have audit rights to confirm vendor management activities that you would normally see that you're having to do yourself. You just extend that work out to that third party. So it's a big topic, but I would say segment your vendor base, understand where the vendors are exposing you to fourth party risk, and then really drill down with the tools you have at your disposal, either through contract control management or through extending that third-party management model out to your fourth parties through your vendors. Hopefully that covers it.
Mike, I just add a short thought about that. Some reactions I've had from some of the banks I've been dealing with, and I'm not going to give any kind of a prescription like you have, and I'm not really qualified, but what I'm hearing is that a lot of the banks are interpreting this mandate to manage fourth parties to be about understanding concentration risk. And it's not just banks. I've heard this from non-banking vendors as well. They want to know how many of their technology service providers, and that's really where this is all focused in my perspective, is how many of them are hosting on Amazon. They want to know when there's a concentration risk.
It's an interesting lens, and I think that can be process focused, it can be geographically focused, and now we get into a whole thing where I think it's, as we said, it's an extension of our third-party risk program. The same lens you look at your own vendors, look at where it's impacting you from a fourth-party perspective. Good point.
Okay, so we are running out of time, so I'm just going to wrap things up. Thank you both for being able to participate in today's webinar. So this does conclude our webinar for today. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out using the contact information shown on the screen, and you can always log into www.hiperos.com and send questions through the Contact Us form on the website. The slides and recorded webcast will be uploaded onto our website and available for replay, and we appreciate your participation, and we thank you and look forward to seeing you at our next event. Thank you. Have a great day.